The statement was heavy with expectation. All men of Alba knew Domhnall meant he wanted the lands to the wall, and that meant Bernicia, a huge chunk of Northumbria, including Bibbenberg's lands. And he had given power to the lords across the lands, a shrewd move. Their warriors remained at Dunnottar for several weeks, and the buoyancy of victory filled the whole place, though not with her. While Osrith listened, as the king toasted those who had lost their lives for him, Osrith turned away, the yawning gap in her heart open and vulnerable. She had to crush her hope that he may be alive. She had even followed Omar back to the church that day, after Sainid had helped with the dead. But all there had been was hot ash, not even one dead body, not even a shape of one person who might have been tagged. The mighty, beautiful, soulful warrior from Doi-Io was dead, and, Osrith had told herself mercilessly, she had better get used to the idea. Domhnall had met her off the field, informing her that King Domhnall wished to see her. Now, he had insisted, when Osrith tried to excuse herself to change. So she had stood before him, Constantine on his right, and had accepted her back, thanking her for her bravery and loyalty. He had suspected Grioghair was disloyal, he added, but hadn't been able to prove it. So she was at liberty, and accepted her as his true Gaelish warrior again. Osrith should have felt deep honour at his words, spoken in public this time, commending her as Gaelish. And, she did. But the palace, from which they had fled nearly 3 years before, Constantine insisting to his father she must go with him, was grey and empty, with the same pale light inching darkness as felt her mood AMD back again as dawn began. Some days Osrith did not feel like rising from her bed, back at the corner of the kitchen, at all. Even at the pinnacle of celebration, she had eaten at the feast, but the food tasted of nothing, and she had crept away to the anesthesia of sleep. One night, a few days after the battle, Constantine cornered her, trying his utmost to guile her into his chamber, but she refused to go with him as he demanded, and pulled out Tagd's seeks when he's tried to tongue her mouth. Osrith had then spent that night getting drunk with Fergus, quietly binging on ale and then newest beef, but that had simply made the next day awful, resulting in a severe headache, and had thrown up for most of it. It was Domhnall who took her for a walk and had broken her of her mood by pushing her into the wellspring, telling her to drink all she could, laughing with her at her hangover. Osrith had been outraged, but then, as he'd offered his hand to pull her out, unable to stop laughing, Osrith's anger faded and she began to laugh too, looping her arm around his and pulling him in too. They then had walked many miles that day along the bank of the river, leaving Dunnottar and Culdis behind, Osrith wrapped in Domhnall's thick, woolen cloak as he carried hers, telling him of her refusal to marry Guthred and her escape with Eric Thurgilson. In the whole time I have known you, I have never known you to drink, Osred, Domhnall had said. What has caused this melancholy? I lost a man I cared dearly for at the battle. But that was all she would confide. A skein of geese flew over Thm, latecomers from the north. Snow began to flit around them. You fought magnificently, Domhnall said. Flann was right, you are the correct owner of that sword. And I now have this. Osrith showed him Tagd's seeks, withdrawing it and allowing the diffused sunlight to melt over its blade. Domhnall said nothing, but put her hand over his as she sheathed it. You saved my life, did you know? Domhnall said, after they had walked a few more miles, to where the riverbank curved and the Forth flooded into the sea. Osrith did not. The day had been a tumult of battle mind, of going with the throes of the day, responding to the changes to gain, little by little, for Domhnall. Remembering this had tipped her resolve. As they walked back towards Dunnottar, Osrith knew what she was to do. She could fight, and could not with a child. And that night, as Glimmery went to his own rest, Osrith felt for the stone which she had once eased out, to hide her treasure in the underground spring. Hope had filled her chest, but reality grounded her. She had hidden it nearly 3 years before. It was unlikely to still be there. Yet, it was there. Her hand, delving through the cool water, found an uneven pile of stones and silt. Her fingers dug down, locating the fist-sized bag of silver that Sobrit had left for himself in the boat, in which Osrith herself had escaped. She removed it, and was glad water had flowed over it long enough that it was logged and the silver did not clink. It paid to be generous to the heathen when she could slip away to see her, Bark, who had explained to her what monthly bleeding meant, and warned her to stay away from Constantine. Osrith had not listened, was needed by Osrith once more. She plunged her hand into the bag of silver, feeling the wet metal in her grasp. There were a strange sensation between her fingers, like grasping damp sand, or trailing her hands in the sea, as she had done when they left Alba for Caeliquilid. Would she still be alive, that healer? If not, someone else would be doing her job, for the adherents to the old Brittonic faith relied on a healer for everything from medicine to knowledge of the seasons, to sort out domestic disputes and to foretell omens of battle. As she felt the precious coins, clinking dully from moisture between her fingers, she closed her eyes and said a heathen promise to herself, closing the door of one life and opening the door on another. It always paid to respect the heathen no matter what the church or any king said, Osrith thought. For, she had used the lily root, yet still she had conceived. Perhaps Beetha's supply of rout was old, or Osrith had padded too weak. Replacing the bag under the stream bed minus a generous supply of silver, before sealing the stone from the low wall, Osrith promised herself that she would make sure that she always had a ready supply of root for the time when her own helping hand was not enough, and to never give her heart to anyone. And the next morning, Osrith began to do what Domhnall had said he wished for her, do what made her happy. And what made Osrith happy was to be a warrior, quick in thought and action. To be that again, she needed to visit the heathen, and to visit the heathen, she needed an excuse. She also had made a promise to her king to spy in Caeliquilid, so she went to find Fergus. He seemed surprised to see her, but continued his fight training with her, which Osrith knew Domhnall would be watching, and it wasn't long before the king came down to see her and asked her to walk with him. Osrith told the king what she had discovered in Caeliquilid, of the heathen loyalty still under a veneer of Christianity, and that there was a clear link between Eothwic and Wessex, for it was a priest from Alfred of Wessex who had sent word to Eothwic about the dream which had allowed Guthred to accede the throne. It reminds me of Strathclyde, Osrith said. The people, as I remember, before we went to Glashcu, we walked so far in their country. They were loyal to the night and say, "Be wind, the sun, the water." Domhnall let her finish as she gathered her thoughts. The people, those whose work supports the nobility, the church, they are still. She looked up to Domhnall as they passed the same spring that his cousin had pushed her into a week before. The land, the people have not changed since the time of Arian, if not before. Should I be you, my king, I would encourage Eochaid to seek to reclaim the land on his southern border as you would seek the land of Bernicia to the wall. This is Northumbria territory, Domhnall replied. Osrith knew him well enough to know this was a game, to argue the opposing point so he could see everything. Surely I gain new enemies. Guthred's tenure is tentative. The blessed Oswald appeared to their former abbot in a dream. Yet it is very convenient how his rule of Northumbria fits politically with Wessex's interest in uniting kingdoms containing Angles and Saxons. It is said to be about opposing the threat of the Norse and Danes. Yes, Osrith, I do see, Domhnall acknowledged. And I am grateful for you telling me this. He stopped walking. The great feast of Candlemas was almost upon them and the weather had been somewhat mild. Likely, then, that snow would blanket the land before Lent. I am also sorry to hear of your loss. Tagd was very dear to me, as I understand, to you. Had I known you were hand, I would never have suggested your alliance to King Guthred. Domhnall smiled. It was mostly veneer. You knew it was the right words at the right time for him. But sometimes you just wanted the words, and Osrith needed them just now. And I would never have found out about Greogair without you having to have endured what you did. Osrith nodded, complicitly. He did know she had seen his face at the close of the battle. It had shown a confirmation of his suspicions, not shock at betrayal. Had he known, and was merely using Greogair? Good for him. If so, it was the MQRK of a king to play all his hands to his advantage, like using the stone from Team Reach and placing at the tripoint of the three kingdoms of Alba, like giving regional lords power over their local people, whose minuscule politics they knew and could preside over it. And, what her king asked of her next, played very much to Osrith's own advantage. He asked her to cross to Chaldees for some days to collect information from the monks about Wessex. 88,888,888. Chaldees was much as Osrith remembered. The short grass before the monastery was almost exactly as she remembered when she had fled from the father of the family she had been given, who had tried to steal Feda's sword. While she researched, she planned, deciding when she could get discreetly across to the village for the lily root or tansy oru. For, it was certain, Osrith deduced, from her lack of monthly blood, and her enlarged, tender breasts, her nipples seeping pale milky fluid which soaked through her bindings and down her stomach, that she was pregnant. And, she was not prepared to be Ayla, kitchen servant at Doia to Malmuir, birthed by the wise Mary, soon to be Constantine's wife, not prepared to support a bastard child of a prince, in Ayla's case, Domhnall, with no prospect of warfare and little prospect of a life for the child, either. Stay away from Constantine, Bach had warned her. In the meantime, her heart soared when she chanced on correspondence from Father Booker. It was telling his colleagues here in Alba that, while Wessex was secure, it had been secured by the Danelaw, introduced to keep Wessex and part of Mercia safe. It could so easily have happened to that could easily gave happened to Alba, had Domhnall lost. Ancient kingdoms would have resorted to local warriors, called from the fields to fight the Norse, and there would have been widespread slaughter. At least now, the lords could send their sons for training at Dunnottar, and modern warfare skills could be taught and disseminated around Domhnall's country. Fragmented, Alba could easily have been overrun and annexed, as the Anglish and Saxon kingdoms had. Osrith read on. King Alfred's daughter Ethelfled, a princess of 14, had been betrothed to a lord, Ethelred of Mercia. Committed this all to memory before she left, names distant to her, lands far. But, there were the life of her brother. And, Osrith needn't imagine it, either, for Biccar had confided the tutored, displaced lord of Bibbenberg, had married and living in Winchester, that he had passed over his first wife, who had gone to a nunnery, following the death of their son, also tutored. Osrith had read that, twice, her heart quickening. Her brother had a whole life, while she had fled Bibbenberg, and, Biccar was with him. A stab of pain crossed her chest, a longing to be with him, ancient thoughts of fleeing to be by his side. As she crossed over the Forth as dawn filtered through dense clouds and thick fog the day after Candlemas, her mind was unmuted and she imagined his life, as lord to Alfred. Was he his loyal Christian warrior, pledging his northern home to ally with the king? Was he Alfred's general, and planned his strategies in battle? The village had changed since Osrith had last been there. A huge, black hole stood out in the fog, where the church had been. Next to it, work had begun on its replacement, and even now, so early in the morning, monks were supervising servants with horses through Tby trees with wood, piling it next to Tby foundation outline of Tby building. Osrith strode hurriedly towards the east of the village, past wooden cottages where their occupants were beginning their day by hanging out their bedding and feeding their animals, to where the heathen quarter was. When she was there before, many trees sheltered around the tiny homes, and here, in Tby cold of the key morning, some of Tby inhabitants were cooking. Apart from some children, scurrying out of her way as she trod on the mud, Osrith was mostly ignored. Where would the heathen healer be? The people here spoke only Cymric, and she began by crossing to the building which Osrith thought she had been to before. It had been by chance she had met Bach, at 12, who sold curatives, and counselled her, while Osrith was trying to bathe discreetly in the Moray. The river was not the same as the sea. Bach had told her the river was fresh and life-giving. To try the water again would try her strength, and she was strong and should not fear. Osrith felt better after that had returned to Bach when she awoke one morning covered in blood with no wound visible. The woman had smiled and told her to bathe in Tby river before giving her strips of cloth to wear in her breeches. You are becoming a woman, it's a sign your body can bear a child. She had smiled, and had pushed away the shard of silver Osrith had known enough to bring with her to pay the heathen woman. Now, Outside the house Osrith was sure was Bark's, a young woman stood, lighting a fire with 2 strike stones. Bark was my mother, the young woman told her tersely. In Cymric. She died? Osrith asked. In the fire, in the church. She watched Bark's daughter, who was called Sula, pour water into a large pot, which she then hung above the fire. I am sorry. I am not. Sula folded her arms. She was black-haired, brown-eyed, dainty-looking but clearly hardy. The king thought she was a witch, and was going to burn her. Burning is what happens to witches in Alba, his servant told us. She looked through the mist towards where the church had stood, and where the new one was growing. So she swore to be a Christian, and gave up our old ways. Then, when the Norse came, died in flame. Anyway, does your God have a sense of humor? I believe he has a way of making things happen for a reason only he knows, Osrith replied, wryly. And then, got down to business. Tansy, she needed, and lily root, root and flower. And you know what to do with these? Sula eyed her with suspicion. Yes, Osrith nodded, as she grasped the silver from her jerkin folds, holding it her cupped hand, so only she could see. I'll make some it up for you, Sula said, collecting the silver in her own hands and beckoned Osrith into her earth-floored, dimly lit cottage, deftly flitting from casket to cupboard, extracting each plant that Osrith had asked for. As she handed them to her wrapped in a thin, linen cloth, Sula narrowed her eyed. I have not seen you, you never came here, and I will deny having ever met you today. Understood, Osrith nodded. I, also. She accepted the medicinal herb bundle from Sula's fingers, tucking it away inside her clothing, before swallowing down the vile-tasting liquor, Tansy, which, as before had, almost at once, caused Osrith's body to contract with more pain than she'd ever felt on a battlefield. Sula held Osrith's hand through the ordeal and, once over, would dispose of the body matter that she had passed in an appropriate ritual. You are not the first, you will not be the last, Sula commented, misinterpreting the relief on Osrith's face as embarrassment. And this is not your first abortion. Osrith said nothing as Sula had her sit back on a chair, knees up, while she packed her with steeped leaf mulch from the pot outside. Do not go near the prince again, Sula instructed, as she pushed the sterile plant matter deeply inside Osrith's cunt with nimble, careful fingers. For you have tangled fate twice with your choice to divert life in this world. Use your gift, my gift, your strength. You are a warrior and you have skill. Many men fight but they are not skilled, and many lords have battle skill but are too weak to lift even a meat blade. Sula stood back, leaving Osrith to pull up her trousers. As she made to get up, Osrith groaned in pain. Sula looked at her, frowning. The caustic should not cause you so much pain, Sula mused. Caustic? Osrith questioned, as the burning sensation came again. Did the healer not show you that time? I was alone. Osrith spat, doubling over in pain. The passage of matter is over, but this stems the bleeding. You must have bled a good deal last time. Then, I did, Osrith admitted. How long does this last? I will perform the ritual once it is over. You should feel no more discomfort. Osrith watched, pain irritating her insides, as she watched Sula place all that she had passed, the germ of hers and Constantine's child, still wrapped in the cloth, into a fire at the back door, throwing a white powder, then a darker one into the flames. The spirit is beyond, now, Sula uttered, quietly. May I ask, she added, as, indeed, Osrith's pain was subsided, the last? Osrith closed her eyes as images of the green sea, of her attackers, of the pain and its seizing in the salt water. I swam in the sea, until it was all over. She watched Sula sigh. Then its sly ritual roam. Something unresolved, from that time, that place, will be with you until, prompted Osrith. But Sula said no more, apart from instructing Osrith to remove the leaves after 2 days. And, Osrith strode shortly afterwards, the land still covered in fog, as strongly as she was able, to her landing point from the Culdees ferry before crossing to the Dunnottar fortress, with Sula's parting words in her ears, you will not bear a child again. As the sun broke through the cloud, its rays lighting up the fortress, Osrith found she was pleased to know that should she give in to humping, she would never again be conflicted between child or lord. And, the tiny voice, which had been burrowing at the back of Osrith's mind, said again, if not with tagged, with nobody. 88,888,888. And life returned to a normal that felt familiar to Osrith. Fergus and Sainid were in charge of training the young sons of lords, who were arriving at Dunnottar, sometimes meeting their fathers, brothers and uncles at the fortress, sometimes coming with a couple of guards and a servant from a far-away ancient kingdom. Constantine was put in charge of a group of young boys to teach them strategy, and Osrith had been asked to teach them the very basics of warfare, how to stand and how to defend. Some came with the idea that they knew more than they did, keen to show what they could do. Many wanted to keep their edged weapons and were outraged when Osrith made them pick up wooden sticks and a thin plank of beech with a handle nailed to the back. In cold, icy mornings, Osrith ended each boy's misconception, and by the beginning of Lent, at which point, Fergus, Domhnall and Sainid showed them the Gaelish moves, for the start of battle, drilling them in lines, having them blood-curdlingly raw, until they could set battle formations automatically. Osrith still had several younger boys, one who was stubborn and very arrogant, and turned out, Constantine told her one evening, to be Owain, Eochaid's eldest son, Dyfnwal's firstborn. So, he was U-A-negation Alpin, Osrith mused, taking in his black, shoulder-length hair. But, she managed to train him till Sainid, though he was just about good enough to not lose his blade after 2 minutes. I will be the king of Pitland and Fortriu, once Domhnall has reigned, Constantine said one night, midway through Lent. They were walking back from the great hall, from a mean supper of fish and root vegetables served as a broth. Osrith stopped, leaning against a wall, which backed out to the river. Daylight still lit Putside, and she watched a little fay punt across Beforth. The kings of Dulriada are subject to the crown now, Constantine continued, leaning by her. Dyfnwal, our cousin, will beg for his life. Dyfnwal will probably not have time to beg for his life, Osrith considered, but didn't say so. Keeping Constantine away from her was her prime concern. He was prone to sulking and whining when he didn't get his own way, and still took it out on Osrith when she refused him, which was every time. Come with me, Osrith, he begged, trying to take her shoulder. He had tried this ruse in February when he had locked her out of the fortress in dense snow, having twisted her arm up behind her back and slapped her hard around the faith. It turned out he had overheard the Frisian fisher boys Gert Thorson and his older brother Rolf praising her potential as a wife as she taught the nobles' sons. She had slept in the stables, and claimed to Sainid, who had deduced that Osrith's face was bruised with more than just slaps, that a dog had attacked her in the village, whose dog, she did not know. So, Osrith was wary of Constantine, who was getting edgy, she knew, because of the imminent arrival from Irionavira and Mary as Domhnall's and his brides. They were to marry at Dunnottar, once the church was rebuilt, and was ready for his immature attempt at coercing her into his bed. He had even made to strike Domhnall one evening after a week of poor weather had driven tensions high. Osrith and Domhnall had fallen into their own easy company, and Constantine had made to argue with him. Domhnall would not, and it took Sainid, under orders from King Domhnall, to take Constantine to his room and bar him in. Domhnall and Osrith had continued their talk, about news from Muir, of the training of the boys, of the endlessly fascinating politics from Strathclyde and beyond the Latin Wall, and the Ulaid, who had done a terrible thing to one of their princes, but Domhnall knew not what. This was done tucked away in the stables, though they had faced a few words from Domhnall which amounted to Osrith was to return to the kitchens of a night from then on. Instead, that time, she ran, which Osrith also knew was an immature thing to do, but knew Constantine well enough to know he wouldn't bother to chase her. That night, she ended up in a very comfortable position between a floor and a ceiling, only woken when matins were rang from Chaldees. There were many times when Osrith would think of that moment, chancing on an air gap built between floors in Dunnottar fortress. Was it caused by Constantine? Or was it Domhnall, her friend, who made her life much more bearable? She would hear her brother say, "We'd bithful Arid," so often that she would feel like screaming. But he was right. Fate was inexorable. No matter what had caused it, Osrith was in a place where she could hear people. Two people. She was above the throne room. Osrith did not know it, but she did her footsteps as she made to scramble out of the snug gap. And then, she heard shouting. Domhnall was shouting at Constantine after what sounded like Constantine had told him he had searched for Osrith that night. "And you didn't find me?" Osrith chuckled to herself. She made to move, to go down to Senedd, to teach her sword skill, but heard Domhnall berate her further. "The women to whom we are betrothed arrive presently. Do you wish to risk all we have worked for? Your father worked for, Muir?" Osrith turned her head to the oak planks, and listened, trying to catch every word. Domhnall should leave. Constantine sulked, wretchedly. The exile, the Dira from Irian. There was a pause, and Osrith waited for footsteps. Was that all? She made to move, anticipating the end of the conversation, then jammed her ear to the boards again. "Flansinna has proposed an amnesty. I have suggested he leave after Rhea and Mary arrive, after the weddings." Osrith's mind skipped to the two princesses. She would love to see them again. And she thought sadly of her friend. She remembered, too, when she had watched from the ramparts as Domhnall's banner of a red right hand embroidered on white flew next to red rampant lion of Aetildilpin as he led the defeated Eochaid back to his newly expanded kingdom, which now included parts of Cumbraland which Guthard thought were his. "Cinna has turned on Don Chardonnil is keeping out it," she heard Domhnall say. "But Glundub will be dragged into a civil war, and he will want Domhnall back beside him, his big brother. Yet, Flansinna is too popular. He is starving out the Norse, mounting hit-and-run attacks. They will bear it for some time, but then will flee. And where do you suppose they will come?" "Here?" Osrith heard Constantine suggest. "Here, in Glarland. They will still raid. But Alfred of Wessex's approach of burghs is paying off. Unity and starvation will be the only things that will work. Eventually, the Danes, the Norse, will either settle and farm, or leave. But there will always be more, driven by glory of their forefathers, that will come from the Northway and Daneland. And now, we have warriors, AMD learning warriors. We are strong, Constantine." Domhnall laughed his jovial laugh. "Alba is the reality our grandfather could only dream of." Now, we look to gain more territory from our borderland. So, that was his plan, Osrith thought. Expansionism, as long as he could keep the Norse away. "Cumbraland?" exclaimed Constantine grumpily. "You promised Eochaid that, and then Guthard will never be your ally." "What of Guthard, anyway?" "Yes, what of Guthard?" It was a good question. Osrith strayed to hear Domhnall's answer. "Gone to Eothwick with men from Wessex, they were told, to support his kingship." "And you will send Osrith?" Osrith lay still, silent, as she heard her name. "So, you ask me, do we send her to Eothwick to be with her husband? It will strengthen Northumbria's claim on Cumbraland, and, of course, through Bibbenberg." "What? Send her to Guthard anyway?" Osrith found herself trembling. They would do this? And the back of her memory spoke to her again. They had done worse, it reminded her. Domhnall had let his lover go, his uncle. Flansinna had, apparently, sold his second wife, a Gaelish princess of the Uineals, into slavery to pursue an even more advantageous union through Malmuir, and Dash. But Osrith jammed her ear to the floor again, desperate to hear more as their voices became muffled. It sounded like Constantine was angry again. "Yet, it was your idea that she wed Guthard, Constantine," Domhnall retorted. "Constantine's idea?" "It was not," he denied. "You said to forge a close diplomatic link," Domhnall pointed out. How often had Osrith admired his way of taking political advantage. But, she wasn't caught up in it, then. Although, Maybe she had always been since she had arrived. But why? Osrith shushed her mind and fought to listen, her heart sinking as she listened on. And what is more diplomatic than a woman who has links to Cumbraland through her mother and Bibbenberg, in the lands we most desire, through her father? So you say. So the evidence suggests, Domhnall pointed out. I did not expect her to give her heart to poor, loyal Taggart, and he to her. He came to me, before the battle, and asked consent for them to marry once the handfast time was done. He had. It was certainly a surprise. But it means nothing. Edra of Bibbenberg's name sits beside that of Guthard Harthknutson on a document that Abbot True has distributed to all monasteries. She is married to Guthard, so could never be married to my loyal warrior. Osrith's mouth grew dry. Edra of Bibbenberg. They knew who she was. No. Constantine fought back. What proof do you have that she is the lost Anglish princess? None. As you are so concerned, Constantine, you shall confront her. Or, Domhnall chuckled, we could sell her back to her uncle should she persist in calling herself Osrith. She is, particularly, used now, is she not? Cousin, why must you take her from me? Stormed Constantine. Why do you take everything I like from me? Because, Domhnall replied, in his well-practiced voice of calm that made the other person feel you were calling them stupid, you are learning to be a Gaelish king, not a selfish, immature princeling. We have not brought security and peace to Alba by chance, we have worked for it, built up alliances. You must forget about Osrith, and grow accustomed that she is an asset to us which needs to be used wisely. So, we will meet the Norse brothers, offer them a battle should they wish it. But we will not offer wealth nor, you will be glad to hear, include the warrior Osrith in any bargain they make in exchange for them to leave.